Welcome to Good Life. I'm Dean Wilson. I'm so glad you're with us wherever you're joining us. If you're joining us here in Santa Barbara, California on television, we welcome you. If you're joining us at goodlifetelevision.org, which we see so many of you are from all around the world, we're so happy you're with us. At goodlifetelevision.org, you can always find all the interviews, the long form interviews. You can also find what we call power clips, where we break up those interviews into some of the great moments. And it's people from all walks of life at Good Life Television. There's great stories, overcomers, and there's just a lot of inspiration, a lot of goodness. We're going to be talking about goodness today with my guest, and there's a lot of goodness there. And so we hope that you'll drink it in. You can also find us at our podcast, which is called Good Life Conversations. It's on all the podcast platforms, Good Life Conversations. We hope you'll check that out. I'm really excited about my guest today. Michelle Van Loon is with me. Michelle is an author. Michelle, welcome.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be with you all.
Yeah, well, we're excited. Michelle, so first of all, I'll just give it on the top, michellevanloon.com, which is Michelle, and then VANLOON.com is where you can find Michelle. Michelle is the author of 6 books, the most recent of which we're going to be talking a lot about. She's contributed to many projects. She's worked in different roles. She's contributed to Christianity Today. She co-founded something called the perennialgen.com, a website for midlife men and women. But writing is really her thing. We all have a thing. I wanted to start with, let's start with your background and kind of your history and who you are. Kind of tell us where you came from, a little bit about your background.
I'd be happy to. I am from the Chicago area originally. My husband and I now live in Sarasota, Florida, where the temperature is in the 90s and the humidity is in the 150% range today, I think. That's how it is all summer here, though. Both of my parents, who are now deceased, were Jewish. I came to faith in Christ when I was in high school, and it went about as well as you can imagine it could have. My parents weren't especially religious, but they had a strong sense of Jewish identity, and so understandably, that decision to follow Jesus on my part to them felt very much like a rejection, a betrayal, and it was difficult. It was difficult for all of us, but I felt deeply, and still do, nothing's changed, that Jesus was who he said he was when he said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. And it wasn't a question. It was kind of, yes, I agree, or no, I don't agree. And I said yes, and now here I am. A lot of life has happened since I was a teenager, and I married. I have 3 children, 2 grandchildren, and a very patient husband, because anyone who's married to a writer is a person who gets a schooling in patience. So,
wow. Have you ever heard of a Messianic Jew named Marty Goetz?
Yeah. I don't know. I know of him. I'm familiar with his music, but we've never met personally. So.
Okay, he's a longtime family friend.
Oh, that's great.
And he's actually coming on the program in a couple of weeks.
Wow.
So stay tuned.
Yeah, definitely.
I told Leanne we're going to have him come on at his piano, and I'm going to just be able to just make requests, and he's going to sing them. He has no choice. He's on my TV show.
That's right. You're the guy putting the quarters in the jukebox, and he's
right. Exactly. Here's the next number. So I wanted to. That's a wonderful story. So I read this sentence in your bio, which I think is really powerful. He said, I believe words of truth and goodness have the power to transform lives.
Mhm.
And I was thinking about that as it relates to, of course, James, the tongue, this little tiny thing in our mouth, the power that the tongue has.
Mhm.
It's really big, isn't it?
It is. It is. A lot of the things, so much of the work that we do in the world, if we are on Team Jesus, is to speak that truth to people, that you are loved, that God has a purpose for you, that you belong here now, that your life matters. That being able to say those things, whether it's in a sentence or whether it's in a book or an article or a play or a piece of curriculum, is we're bearers of the good news.
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah. And it's amazing, you hear stories of it's amazing what, one comment can do.
Yes.
If you think about that,
Mhm.
you think about a kid who, something his coach said to him in 7th grade, he's never forgotten,
It's
and I think sometimes we overlook the power that we have in terms of speaking life. And I mean, it's an opportunity.
It absolutely is. I remember in that, and is there anything more kind of fragile than a 7th grade kid in the world?
Right.
It
I don't
seems
even want
like,
to think about my 7th grade year. You have
oh,
no idea the trauma.
it's so hard. My youngest grandson is a 7th grader, and we're going to be seeing him in a couple of weeks. And I'm kind of remembering that, about that's part of what being a writer is about too, is being able to remember those things. When I was in 7th grade, I had braces, long, straight blonde hair, like all the girls on the Brady Bunch had, was in style. Um, I was not those girls. And I remember my mom signing me up for a kind of like a poise and charm class, which I could still use to this day. But the woman who was running the class said to me at one point, you know, some people are meant to stay behind the scenes in life.
Oh,
I was really awkward and kind of shy and kind of just like every 7th grader, the ones that kind of can carry themselves with a little bit of confidence, um, kind of, they still feel that way inside. I'm pretty sure. But that imprinted me for a long, long time, that obviously this polished adult who had done modeling and who was on local TV commercials, if she said that about me, then it must be true.
mm-hmm.
And I think my life, starting with those early days when I met Jesus, and chose to begin following him, even though I knew he was telling me different things than that lady, than the world around me. Um, it was a stretch, and kind of a leap of faith to begin to believe that maybe they were wrong and maybe he was right,
Mm.
you know? So,
Yeah. Oh, that's so
mm,
powerful.
mhm.
Yeah, the power of life and death. It doesn't get much more significant than that.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't.
So tell us about your writing journey, kind of where it started.
Oh, this is kind of a fun story. It's another kind of illustration of how a single sentence sometimes can send your life in a completely different direction. This one, a very positive one. After my husband and I got married, we attended church with a woman who worked for the National Public Radio outlet in Chicago. And they were producing a children's show at that time, just locally, and they were using Chicago public school children as the voice talent. And this friend came to me and said, we are always looking for scripts, and you have such colorful vocabulary, and I know that you kind of like to write. Maybe this is something you'd like to try. It doesn't pay anything, but it could be a really interesting experience for you. And I was amazed. I was like, this is what I've been waiting for. I didn't know I was waiting for that invitation, but I went to the library. I checked out every book they had on script writing, on radio. I started just inhaling the language of dialogue and creating dialogue, understanding conflict, all of those things that went into kind of creating little radio dramas. And I started writing, and they produced what I wrote. Now, if I were to hear any of those scripts today, I'd probably be kind of horrified. I've written a few more words since then. I've gotten a little more practice in, but they produced them. They saw that there was something of value, that was functionally good enough to be able to create material. And then I went from being an awkward kid that was writing journal entries alone in my room, and just quietly keeping a diary when I was a teen, to I can do this. And so one thing led to another. And that's kind of how my writing journey started. But it took one person just saying it as an aside. And interestingly, the woman that said that to me, I ran into her years later. And I said, do you remember saying this to me? Do you remember? And she said, I'm drawing a complete blank. I believe you. I don't doubt that what you're saying is true, but I don't remember ever saying that to you. But I do remember you being in the studio, and that must have been how you got there, so.
Wow. So,
Yeah,
so that's where it started.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that wonderful?
Yeah.
Well, there's a list of books here that I won't read the whole list, but again, I'd encourage people to go to michellevanloon.com. Michelle Van Loon is my guest. I want to talk about your newest project. The book is Translating Your Past, Finding Meaning in Family Ancestry, Genetic Clues and Generational Trauma, Herald Press. And it came out in February. And I'll just read this quick description. Michelle Van Loon helps readers uncover how patterns and gaps in family histories, generational trauma, adoption, genetic clues and surprises, spiritual history, and the church help us translate our own pasts and understand why these stories matter. I want you to just kind of give an overview of what this book is about. Well, let's start with that. You give us kind of an overview. Why did you write the book, and what is it about?
Sure, I'd be happy to. A lot of us find ourselves, particularly when we get to the second half of our lives, thinking about those that have come before us. A lot of people who find themselves interested in genealogy research, for example, tend to be in the second half of their life, older, with some time to reflect and begin to think about legacy. So you might be one of those people that's done a consumer DNA test like an Ancestry.com, or you might be somebody that's putting together the family photo albums after parents pass. Or you're sitting in a doctor's office and they ask for family medical history. All of those things kind of are gateways into thinking about the people that have come before us that have contributed to who we are. Those tend to be, they're important questions, but I've found through my own kind of journey through my family's past, my family's ancestry, that is pretty complicated story, but not more complicated than I think a lot of us have complicated family histories. But trying to understand how all of those parts, whether it's genes, whether it's adoption, whether it's the trauma of past generations, whether it's the physical, whether it's the emotional, there's all kinds of parts that go into making a family tree. And so my interest in this topic started when I was in high school, probably right around the time that I began following Jesus. And that was around the time that Roots was on TV, the miniseries Roots, that just was kind of a phenomenon. Writer Alex Haley, for those that aren't familiar, had gone and kind of traced his family's history back to Africa, followed the journey across the Atlantic into slavery here in the United States. And so he told that story in generations. Before that time, most family history tended to be the domain of the privileged, like people that were trying to join the Daughters of the American Revolution and had to prove that they had, a family member that was that they had a claim to be able to be in that organization. So Alex Haley changed that, and that being kind of out there in the ether of our culture got me thinking and got me curious about our own family story. It was a story that I had learned through reaction and kind of the shutdown of any questions that I'd always received before, that it was kind of an off limits subject. But I found enough courage because of the TV show and because so many people were talking about it to start pushing a little harder. And this book is the result of those questions.
Wow. Yeah, I've always found it interesting that they start with the genealogy in terms of Jesus, and why do they tell us all this kind of thing? That it matters. So let's talk for a second about generational curses.
Mm-hmm.
That's something that I hear kind of debated or talked about in certain circles. What is your take on that?
Definitely. It's not just reserved for certain streams in the church. I tell the story in the book of I was watching a Food Network show, and the subject of generational curses came up in this restaurant renovation show that was on. And I was surprised that it was kind of out there as a discussion point and addressed as both a thing and also an experience that the people were living out that were subjects of that show. I prefer to kind of go down the road of generational consequences. I think that scripture presents that language to us. We see it in the Old Testament, but it is descriptive as well. There is a prescriptive kind of bit to it, but it is primarily descriptive. That if and we see it in language when we're talking about addictions, for example, that if there's a history of alcoholism or drug abuse in a family, there's a propensity that is more than just environmental in many cases. And so it can be consequences as well as a description. We are not bound to pay for the sins of our great-grandparents, but we live and we are born into the consequences of their choices, both positive and negative.
Hmm. And that's very interesting. And let's talk for a second about adoption, which is, a wonderful thing, a complex thing. It's a scriptural concept, but talk about adoption.
Right. Well, that is part of my family's story. And that was the verboten topic in my childhood home because of the way that adoption was handled. My mom was born in New York in 1938, and her mom died within days after my mom's birth. And so there was this little baby, and there was a bereaved father and a much older brother who was kind of self-sufficient, as much as a 10-year-old could be, but in New York in the 30s, a 10-year-old could dress and feed himself and kind of, manage himself, but no one knew what to do with this baby. And so the word went out to the broader family that this terrible thing had happened to my grandmother. And so some relatives that were second or third cousins, I'm still trying to put together exactly where that connection was, but some relatives that lived in Chicago stepped forward and said, we will adopt this baby as long as everyone promises to keep it a great big secret. And so it wasn't uncommon back then. That was kind of conventional wisdom in the first half of the 20th century and before, particularly in cases of adoption. So my mom grew up going to New York every single year and seeing these relatives that just fawned all over her, treated her completely different than her adopted brother, who came just from an agency, no family connection. And she didn't know that she was adopted, although she looked very different than her adoptive parents. There was no resemblance. 6 weeks before she was to marry my father, her birth father called and said, I want to come to your wedding. I'm your father. It's been a big secret, but I can't stand it anymore. And so suddenly my mom had her life completely turned upside down.
Wow.
And, there's a lot of people now who are doing DNA tests, and we see these stories pretty regularly in the media of people who take a DNA test and they find out that dad wasn't their dad, mom wasn't their mom, or they've got secret siblings. So we're kind of living through another wave of people that are finding out as truth is seeping in. By the time I was a teenager, I knew the outlines of the story. And it was deeply painful for my mom. I wish that they had had things like counseling and some of that other support that is much more available now to help her navigate that, because it was so traumatic. And she kind of had to rewrite her whole life story and try to renegotiate her relationship with her family, who was all in on the secret. And secrets hardly ever, they mostly backfire in families. And this one carried lots of pain with it. So when I started asking questions, it was the beginning of me putting together some of the pieces that my mom just could not let herself explore.
What a story.
I know it is kind of like a Lifetime movie, except that I lived with the pain of that. And my mom, it was a point of great just shame and confusion for her for the rest of her life. You know, she just, it was understandably.
Right. Wow. We only have a couple minutes left with Michelle Van Loon. The book is Translating Your Past. Michelle, how can translating kind of the threads of our past help us pass on a legacy to the next generation?
Well, I start with all the different categories that I kind of lay out in the book, you know, whether it's generational consequences or DNA or adoption. You know, I kind of have chapters devoted to all of these different categories, but I start with tracing the theme through scripture, because I think being able to understand, if you are a follower of Jesus, if you're somebody who's even watching who is just really curious about who God is and how he fits into your story, for me, it was helpful to be able to anchor my own family's story with all the mess and all the chaos to God's bigger story.
Right.
And genealogy is a lot more important, I think, than we individual Americans like to think. Like, did you know that there's more than 9 genealogies in the book of Genesis alone? Like, we start, you know, a lot of us kind of jump over that, unless we're looking for a name for our new hamster, maybe, you know, pretty amazing names in the Bible that would be great pet names too. But to be able to anchor ourselves to that, as well as to recognize who we belong to, our relationships at church are a part of our story, the trauma of the past is a part of our story, that all of this goes in to who we are. Right. And the better that we can understand ourselves in that way, without being like super just interior about it, the more healthy of people that we are to the world around us, and as we're passing on those stories to the next generations and our own family.
Yes, that's good. The larger story.
Always.
I'm thinking about that right now. The larger story. What is the larger story? You know, I think sometimes I just think we just see this little little blip and we think, oh, I got this down. And then you're like, maybe not. There's a larger story going on, isn't there?
You know, it should be humbling. That we're not the whole enchilada. We are not the whole bowl of matzo ball soup. We are not, you know, all of those things. That we're a part of something else, and that we connect to the world around us. It's those places of sometimes pain and sorrow that are our connection to the stories of others in much more powerful ways than our victories or how awesome we think we are, you know.
Right. Yeah, beautifully said. Michelle Van Loon, michellevanloon.com. I'd encourage you to pick up the book, Translating Your Past. Very interesting work. And Michelle, I'm so grateful you came on today.
Thank you so much for having me. God bless.
And we'll see you all next time.